On October 21, 2022, the White House issued a triumphant briefing on the impact of its unprecedented sweeping export controls on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The narrative was crystal clear. The United States was successfully choking off the technological oxygen of its strategic competitors. The official line was that American leadership in critical, foundational technologies was being secured, and that the domestic industrial base would rapidly revitalize under the protective umbrella of national security mandates. Hours later, on that very same day, a quiet but devastating series of market assessments and supply chain updates began trickling out from the heart of Silicon Valley. Major American semiconductor, tool makers, and chip designers were actively recalculating their revenue projections, preparing to slash billions of dollars from their forecasts because they were suddenly cut off from their fastest-growing commercial market. At the exact same time, documented procurement records from East Asia revealed that logistics firms and shell companies were already rearranging shipping manifests, routing critical components through third-party hubs to bypass the new restrictions. These two narratives cannot both be true. We are told that Washington can command the global technology market by administrative decree, freezing its adversaries in place while domestic innovators happily march in lockstep with national security objectives. But the reality on the ground tells us something completely different. It tells us that the tools of economic statecraft are actively cannibalizing the very commercial engines that fund American technological supremacy in the first place. The media is asking whether Washington's export controls are tough enough to stop the rise of alternative technology ecosystems. They are asking if a few more sanctions, a few more blacklists, or a few more enforcement officers will finally seal the cracks in the economic wall. That is the wrong question. It completely misses the structural reality of how modern technology is built, funded, and deployed. The right question is this: has Washington's aggressive use of unilateral technology blockades inadvertently trapped the United States and its premier technology sector in a structural trap, all while forcing its most powerful adversaries to build a parallel, sanction-proof industrial alliance? To understand how we got here, we have to look past the daily headlines. We have to look past the political theater of congressional hearings and corporate press releases. We need a rigorous, objective lens to see the gears actually turning underneath the global economy. I call it the dual-rate asymmetric innovation framework. It is built directly on the foundation of classic game theory and international relations scholarship, specifically Nash equilibrium dynamics and the structural traps of defensive realism. It posits that a major power cannot maintain an absolute technological monopoly when its own domestic innovators depend on global commercial scale to fund their research and development, while its adversaries are driven by an existential imperative to achieve domestic self-sufficiency. The framework has three distinct, interlocking parts. Condition 1 is the scale innovation feedback loop. In the high technology sector, commercial revenue is not just profit. It is the raw fuel for the next generation of discovery. If you cut off access to a massive commercial market, you do not just starve your rival of chips today. You starve your own companies of the capital they need to invent the chips of tomorrow. Condition 2 is the adversarial forced convergence. When a target state is facing an absolute cutoff from critical technology, its internal market forces completely realign. Commercial entities that previously preferred cheap, reliable imports are suddenly forced by sheer survival to buy from domestic suppliers, no matter how inefficient or primitive those suppliers might be at first. This creates a massive, captive domestic market that artificially accelerates the adversary's learning curve. Condition 3 is the alliance asymmetry trap. While the sanctioning state must rely on complex, fragile coalitions of democratic allies who are constantly tempted to cheat or find loopholes to protect their own commercial interests, the targeted states face no such coordination problem. Their alignment is forged in the fires of mutual exclusion. They do not need shared values. They only need a shared existential vulnerability to the same financial and technological architecture. Let us break these conditions down one by one. Condition 1, the scale innovation feedback loop. Consider the basic economics of the semiconductor industry. It is arguably the most capital-intensive industry in human history. Developing a single next-generation microchip architecture can cost hundreds of millions of dollars in design talent alone. Building and equipping a single advanced fabrication plant, a fab, now routinely costs well over $15 billion. Where does that money come from? It does not come from government grants or national security subsidies. Government funding is a drop in the bucket. The vast majority of that capital comes from high-volume, commercial sales to global markets. For the past 2 decades, the largest, fastest-growing market for commercial electronics and semiconductor consumption has been East Asia, specifically China. When Washington imposes sweeping restrictions that prevent American companies from selling high-margin, commercial artificial intelligence chips or advanced manufacturing equipment to this market, it creates an immediate structural revenue deficit for Silicon Valley. Think about it this way. If an American tech giant loses 20 or 30% of its global revenue overnight due to an export ban, that is not just a bad quarter for Wall Street. That is a direct, permanent reduction in the company's research and development budget for the next 5 years. And in the technology race, 5 years is an eternity. The supreme irony of the Washington playbook is that it assumes American technological dominance is a permanent, static fact. It treats Silicon Valley's leadership as an inherent trait rather than a dynamic process that must be constantly funded by global commerce. By restricting the market, Washington is inadvertently defunding the very innovation machine it seeks to protect. Condition 2. The adversarial forced convergence. Let us look at what happens on the other side of the equation. Before the imposition of severe export controls, domestic technology firms in targeted states like China had very little incentive to buy locally produced components. Why would a Chinese smartphone maker or cloud provider buy a domestic chip that was 3 generations behind, less energy efficient, and more expensive, when they could simply buy the state-of-the-art product from California? Market forces naturally kept the adversary dependent on American technology. The globalized supply chain was Washington's greatest lever of geopolitical influence because it created deep, structural dependencies. But the moment you weaponize that dependency completely, you destroy its utility. When Washington made it clear that access to American chips and software could be severed at any moment by an administrative pen stroke, it triggered an absolute paradigm shift. Suddenly, for a tech firm in Shanghai, Shenzhen, or Moscow, buying domestic components was no longer a matter of corporate efficiency. It became a matter of corporate survival. This created what economists call a guaranteed domestic demand shock. Millions of capital dollars that used to flow into the pockets of American designers began pouring into domestic semiconductor design firms, material suppliers, and equipment makers within the targeted state. Yes, their initial products were inferior. Yes, their yields were lower. But they now had something they never had before, a massive captive market of desperate, well-funded domestic buyers willing to accept lower quality, while the local industry worked through its learning curve. History tells us exactly what happens next. When you give a highly capable, scientifically literate industrial society a captive market and unlimited state backing, they close the technological gap far faster than traditional economic models predict. The blockade does not stop them. It simply serves as the ultimate catalyst for their industrial mobilization. Condition 3. The Alliance Asymmetry Trap. This brings us directly to the formation of the CRINK Bloc, the rapidly tightening alignment between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. For years, mainstream Western foreign policy analysts dismissed the idea of a meaningful strategic alliance between these states. They pointed out the historical grievances, the deep cultural differences, the radically divergent economic models, and the lack of a shared ideological framework. They argued that these nations could never truly coordinate their grand strategies because they did not trust each other. That analysis was blind to the structural realities of game theory. An alliance does not require trust. It does not require shared values. It requires a shared structural position within the international system. When the United States heavily sanctions Russia, cuts off Iran from global financial messaging networks, places sweeping technology embargoes on China, and isolates North Korea, it creates a powerful, unified structural incentive for these states to build a parallel international architecture. They are trapped in the same boat, so they have no choice but to row in the same direction. And look at how their economies complement each other within this parallel framework. China possesses the world's most massive industrial manufacturing base and a rapidly advancing technological apparatus. Russia possesses unparalleled mineral wealth, vast energy reserves, and deep expertise in foundational physics and military engineering. Iran offers strategic geographical positioning, decades of experience in sanction evasion logistics, and a highly developed domestic missile and drone manufacturing sector. North Korea provides a massive, state-directed industrial labor force and vast stockpiles of conventional munitions. When these four economies begin to integrate, they create a self-sustaining, closed-loop system that is highly resistant to Western economic pressure. Russia's energy flows directly into China's factories. China's industrial machinery and dual-use technology flow back into Russia's defense sector. Iran and North Korea act as highly specialized nodes, providing specific military capabilities and operational testing grounds, while receiving financial lifelines and technological transfers in return. Washington's strategy relies on the assumption that it can play whack-a-mole with these actors, punishing each one individually, without realizing that every blow it strikes simply drives them closer together, solidifying a bloc that possesses the complete spectrum of resources, labor, energy, and technology required for long-term strategic defiance. Let us look at the hard, undeniable data. Let us move past theory and look at the evidence dump that proves this structural shift is already well underway. Almost nobody in the mainstream media is talking about the precise financial and trade data mapping this realignment. Let us start with the sheer volume of trade shifting away from Western currencies. According to official central bank data and international trade repositories, in the year 2021, over 80% of Russia's bilateral trade with China was settled in US dollars or euros. By late 2023, that dynamic had completely inverted. Well over 90% of their bilateral trade was being settled in Chinese yuan or Russian rubles. This is not a temporary shift. This is a permanent structural de-dollarization of a major global trade corridor. Let us look at the semiconductor data. In September 2023, Huawei shocked the global tech industry by quietly releasing its Mate 60 Pro smartphone. It was powered by the Kirin 9000S processor, a 7-nanometer system on a chip that featured advanced 5G connectivity. Why did this matter? It mattered because, according to the explicit design of Washington's export controls, such a chip should have been impossible for a sanctioned Chinese firm to manufacture. Huawei had been cut off from advanced American design software, and Chinese chipmakers were banned from importing the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines produced exclusively by the Dutch firm ASML. Yet, a detailed teardown by the independent analytical firm Tech Insights confirmed that the chip was real, it was advanced, and it was manufactured domestically in China by SMIC using modified deep ultraviolet lithography equipment. The export controls did not prevent the development of advanced domestic capability. They simply hid its progress until it emerged fully formed into the market, catching Western regulators completely off guard. Let us look at the flows of dual-use technology. Independent customs data analysis from various international trade trackers reveals that throughout 2024 and 2025, Chinese exports of advanced machine tools, electronic integrated circuits, and navigation equipment to Russia surged by hundreds of percentage points compared to pre-war levels. One specific metric stands out. By mid-2024, Chinese entities were reportedly supplying approximately 90% of Russia's imports of microelectronics used in the production of tanks, aircraft, and precision weaponry. This is the say the quiet part out loud moment for global geopolitics. The United States cannot isolate a country with an 11-time zone landmass filled with oil and minerals when that country shares a massive, porous land border with the world's second-largest economy and premier manufacturing superpower. The sanctions did not starve the Russian defense industrial base. They simply transferred the supply chains from European suppliers to Chinese ones, tying the economic fates of Moscow and Beijing closer together than ever before. Let us look at the energy architecture. Consider the power of Siberia pipeline network and the rapidly expanding maritime shipping lanes through the Northern Sea route. Russia's seaborne crude exports to China and India have reached consistent, historic highs, frequently averaging over 2 million barrels per day. The money generated from these sales flows through regional banks that use China's cross-border interbank payment system, entirely bypassing the Western financial grid. The capital is completely insulated from Washington's enforcement mechanisms. Everything connects. The semiconductor ban in Silicon Valley directly drives China's quest for technology independence, which drives its need for secure energy inputs, which drives its funding of Russia's resource economy, which provides Russia the strategic space to support Iranian and North Korean defense initiatives. It is a single, interconnected, self-reinforcing macroeconomic ecosystem. Now, I want to be entirely fair. I never want you to just nod along with my analysis. I want you to question the data, examine the premises, and think critically. So, let us construct the absolute strongest, most rigorous version of the opposing argument. The mainstream consensus in Washington, championed by a wide array of national security analysts, think tanks, and policymakers, argues that export controls and technological blockades are highly effective precisely because the United States and its closest allies still maintain an absolute monopoly on the most complex, irreplaceable intellectual property in the world. They will point out that while China can manufacture 7-nanometer chips through brute force, expensive engineering workarounds, it still cannot easily replicate the truly cutting-edge 2-nanometer or 3-nanometer processes that are currently coming online in Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States. They will argue that the yield rates for these advanced Chinese chips are unsustainably low, making them commercially unviable on a global scale. Furthermore, the Steelman argument emphasizes that the CRINK Bloc is fundamentally fragile because it is built on a transactional foundation of convenience. Russia is terrified of becoming a mere resource colony for Beijing. China is deeply concerned about maintaining its access to European and American consumer markets and cannot afford to trigger full-scale secondary sanctions that would jeopardize its trillions of dollars in Western trade. Therefore, the argument goes, if Washington keeps the pressure high, maintains its technological lead at the absolute highest end of the spectrum, and aggressively polices the margins, the cost of this parallel ecosystem will eventually become too high for these states to bear, leading to internal economic stagnation and structural collapse. That is a genuinely strong argument. It is sophisticated, it is grounded in real economic metrics, and it is championed by deeply serious people. But here is what it cannot explain. It cannot explain the structural shift from absolute efficiency to absolute resilience that we are witnessing across the globe. The Steelman argument assumes that these nations are operating on a traditional, peacetime, profit-maximizing corporate logic. It assumes that if a domestic chip costs 3 times more to produce than an imported one, a Chinese or Russian firm will eventually give up and stop producing it. But we are no longer living in a world governed purely by commercial profit maximization. We are living in a world governed by state survival. When a state views its technological dependence as an existential vulnerability that could lead to its total domestic or military paralysis, the traditional concept of commercial viability goes completely out the window. The state will gladly subsidize inefficient production indefinitely because the alternative is complete strategic vulnerability. The mainstream view cannot explain why, despite years of ever-tightening restrictions, the industrial and military output of the CRINK Bloc has not collapsed, but has instead reorganized, adapted, and in many critical sectors, expanded. It cannot explain how Russia, facing the most extensive sanctions regime in modern history, managed to transition its economy to a highly productive wartime footing while maintaining stable domestic consumption. To truly understand this pattern, we have to lift our gaze from the immediate news cycle. We need to step out of the contemporary moment and look at the deep, timeless currents of history and political philosophy. This is not a new story. This is a recurring, structural pattern of human civilization. Think back to the Peloponnesian War, specifically to the structural dynamics between Athens and Sparta. Athens was the supreme maritime power of its day. It was an economic dynamo, a hub of culture, philosophy, and sophisticated financial networks. It controlled the trade routes of the Aegean Sea through its command of naval technology and its vast wealth. Sparta, by contrast, was an insular, land-based, highly disciplined military society. It lacked the sophistication, the wealth, and the artistic brilliance of Athens. For decades, Athens used its maritime dominance and its economic leverage to dictate terms to the Greek world. It assumed that its structural superiority was permanent because no other city-state could match its financial resources or its naval technology. But Athens made a fatal miscalculation. It assumed its adversaries would remain static. By aggressively flexing its economic and strategic muscles, most notably through actions like the Megarian Decree, one of the earliest recorded economic embargoes in history, Athens forced its disparate, often conflicting rivals to realize that their only hope of survival lay in complete, unified coordination. Sparta was forced to adapt. It realized it could not defeat Athens on land alone while Athens controlled the seas. So, what did Sparta do? It did something previously unthinkable. It forged an alliance with its historical, existential enemy, the Persian Empire. Persia provided the vast financial resources and timber that Sparta lacked. With Persian gold, Sparta built a formidable navy, challenged Athenian naval supremacy, and ultimately severed Athens' vital grain supply lines through the Hellespont. The very sophistication, arrogance, and aggressive economic overreach of Athens are what created the structural conditions for its own encirclement and ultimate defeat. It forced an unnatural, highly potent alliance between a land power and a wealthy empire, completely altering the balance of power in the ancient world. We see the exact same pattern playing out today. Washington is playing the role of Athens, relying on its sophisticated financial networks and its technological dominance to command global behavior. But in doing so, it is forcing the contemporary land powers of Eurasia to bridge their historical divides and construct a parallel strategic reality. How do we test this theory going forward? How do we know if the dual-rate asymmetric innovation and framework is an accurate description of reality, or if the mainstream Washington consensus is correct? We look for specific falsifiable signals in the real world. Over the coming months, I want you to watch 3 specific developments very closely. First, follow the money through the small, regional, non-Western banking system. Do not watch the major state-owned banks in Beijing or Moscow. They are too exposed to the Western financial system and will try to look compliant. Instead, watch the explosion of Tier 2 and Tier 3 regional banks located in places like Western China, Central Asia, and the Gulf states. Watch what they don't say. Pay close attention to the silence as a signal. Look for the sudden, quiet creation of new clearing mechanisms and electronic ledger systems that completely omit any reference to Western clearinghouses. If you see a steady, quiet migration of cross-border trade settlements into these unheralded, insulated channels, it means the parallel financial grid is successfully hardening itself against any potential secondary sanctions. Second, watch the global market for legacy, mature node semiconductors, the chips built on older 28 nanometer, 40 nanometer, or 65 nanometer processes. The mainstream media ignores these chips because they are not exciting. They are not the brains of the latest generative artificial intelligence models, but legacy chips are the unheralded workhorses of the global economy. They are the chips that run our automobiles, our industrial manufacturing plants, our electrical grids, our medical devices, and our military hardware. Watch the massive volume of capital China is pouring into mature node fabrication facilities. If we see China successfully cornering the global market for these foundational, everyday chips over the next couple of years, they will achieve a powerful asymmetric counter-leverage. They will effectively gain the ability to shut down Western automotive and industrial supply chains at will, completely neutralizing Washington's high-end technological leverage. Third, watch the defense procurement and joint military exercise schedules within the CRINK Bloc. Specifically, watch for the deep integration of electronic warfare systems, secure satellite communication protocols, and joint drone manufacturing initiatives between Russian, Chinese, and Iranian entities. If we see these nations moving past simple arms sales and into the realm of deep foundational co-development of military technology, it will provide definitive proof that the alliance has transcended a mere marriage of convenience. It will mean they are successfully building a unified, interoperable military apparatus designed specifically to blind and counter Western precision-guided systems. Here is your homework. Do not take my word for any of this. I want you to go out and do the primary research yourself. Find the official, public text of the October 2022 Bureau of Industry and Security Export Control Regulations, issued by the U.S. Department of Commerce. Read through the specific technical thresholds they laid down for computing performance and interconnect bandwidth. Then, take those parameters and place them directly alongside the publicly available teardowns, technical papers, and benchmark analyses of recent Chinese-manufactured AI accelerators and smartphones published by independent global research firms like Tech Insights or Tom's Hardware. Look at the dates, look at the specifications. Look at how quickly the actual manufacturing reality on the ground bypassed the administrative barriers set by the regulators. Come argue with me in the comments. Find the weakest point in my argument. Tell me if you think I am overestimating the coordination capacity of the CRINK Bloc, or if you believe Silicon Valley can find a way to out-innovate its structural revenue loss. I welcome the challenge. That is how we sharpen our understanding. But as you do that homework, and as you watch the global chess pieces move over the coming months, I want to leave you with one final, haunting reframe question. What if the ultimate danger of Washington's economic statecraft is not that it will fail to isolate America's adversaries, but rather that it will succeed so completely in isolating them that the United States inadvertently isolates itself from the most dynamic, fast-evolving, and resource-rich industrial ecosystem on Earth? Think about that. Really think about it.